Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf wraps up a discussion the Gemara is in the middle of about what type of animal foods you are allowed to purchase with Meiser Sheni money. Then the Gemara refers back to our mission, which was discussing an Eruv, and the rest of the daf will be discussing what kind of foods you can use for the Eruv, and it specifies a number of different types of plants which are edible but are not possibly prepared in the correct or the best way. And the Gemara will have a lengthy discussion about which ones you can use for an Eruv and which you cannot. Towards the end, we'll have a little bit about how much food you need specifically for an Eruv. So first of all, the Gemara is in the middle of a discussion about Meiser Sheni money. We know that Meiser Sheni money has to be used to buy food, and the question is, can Meiser Sheni money be used to buy fish? We ended up with a Machlokes Tanaim, and we said that Machlokes Tanaim was based on the pasuk, which lists the foods that you're allowed to buy, and it has a general term, a klal, and then it has four specific items. That's prat, very specific list, and then it has a klal, a general term afterwards. So it's a klal, prat, klal, but it could also be what's called a riboy or a miyut, and then a riboy. So we said that according to one pshat, one of the opinions of the Tanaim, it's a riboy miyut riboy, which is more inclusive, and therefore you are allowed to buy fish. According to the other pshat, it's a klal prat klal, which is more exclusive, and therefore it excludes fish. The Gemara now points out that even within this opinion, there's a variation. There are two brises which express the rules differently. The Gemara is trying to figure out what the difference between the brises are. The Gemara is going to end up saying that the difference is whether or not you're allowed to buy birds, whether or not you're allowed to buy fowl. And the Gemara will have to explain, even though they both hold of klal prat klal, how do they understand the mechanism of klal prat klal differently to include or exclude fowl. So the Gemara has said that you have two brises expressing what it is that you're allowed to buy with Meiser Sheni money. What is the rule that's learned from the klal prat klal? The first brisa says it has to be pri ugedule karka. It has to be a fruit which comes from a fruit, meaning something that's born from another edible thing. And it has to be something which is nourished from the ground. Then we have another brisa which seems to add a third condition, which is it has to be that it was created, formed from the earth. So the Gemara says, what's the difference between them? The Gemara has just said fish is the difference between them. The Gemara rejects that now because the Gemara says that fish is also not considered to be gidulei karka. It's not considered to be nourished from the ground. So it is neither. It's not nourished from the ground. It's also not created from the ground. So it would be excluded according to both these brises, whether you define it as food from fruit and nourished from the ground, or whether you define it as all those two plus being created from the ground. So Gemara is proving now that fish is not considered to be nourished from the ground and would be excluded from that rule. So the Gemara says we have a statement of Abaye. Abaye is the one who said this answer. He says that there are three types of insects. There's water insects, there's flying insects, and there are ground insects. If you eat a water insect, you are violating 4 Isur Deraisa. You eat a ground insect, you're violating 5 Isur Deraisa. And eat a flying insect, you're violating 6 Isur Deraisa. The Gemara's question is, if you are going to tell me that water insects are also counted as nourished from the ground, then it would have to have additional ground Isurim. It wouldn't just be 4 Isurim, it would be 7 Isurim, Rashi says, because you would combine the ground Isurim and the water Isurim. Some of them on the list of the 4 and the 5 overlap, but the other ones you would end up with a total of 7. So Gemara says so it can't be. And therefore we're going to say that anything which is from the water is excluded, is not considered growing from the ground. So what then is the difference between these two approaches? What is it which is considered to be grown, which is considered to be nourished from the ground, but is not considered to be formed from the ground? So Gemara says it's birds. We say in Masechta Chulin, birds are considered to be nourished from the ground. They do eat ground food. However, they were not created from earth. They were created from a mixture of earth and water. They were created from the rekek, from the shore, where it is it's a mixture of water and earth over there. So Gemara says, okay. So the machlokes between these two opinions is whether you include birds or not. How do they understand the psukim differently? So Gemara says there, machlokes is how you understand the rules of klal prat klal. According to the one which includes birds, and holds that it is included, they say that when you have a klal prat klal, the last klal is the main thing, and therefore you're primarily including everything. You really have a prat and a klal, because the last klal is the main one. You have a prat and a klal. A prat and a klal means you have a prat and then you have a klal, which includes everything. there is an additional first klal that takes one thing out. Okay, so therefore you have one thing that's removed from the list, but that's fish. Birds do stay on the list. You only have to be similar to what's on the list in the two ways. However, the other one says no. When you have a klal prat klal, the first klal is the main thing. So what you really have is a klal prat, and then there's an extra klal hanging on. A klal prat means you're pretty much excluding everything. And the last klal comes and it adds on a little bit. Okay, so there's one other thing that's included. So that would be anything which has all three things. It's from the ground, it's made from the ground, and it is fruit from fruit. That would exclude birds. Birds would not fit into that category. It would have to be similar in all three ways in order for it to count as part of the things that qualify for this list of things you're allowed to buy with Meiser Sheni money. We're now shifts gears to discuss what types of food you're allowed to use to set up an Eruv. As we said, an Eruv Tchumen or Eruv Chatzeris consists of setting food someplace so that it becomes your primary residence where your food is. What type of food can you use for that? It's got to be real food. It's got to be food you can eat, not spices or things. The Gemara is going to discuss a number of herbs which are primarily spices and are used for flavor, but could potentially be eaten straight and made into a meal. So the Gemara says that Rav Huda said the name of Rav Shimon bar Shilas, the name of Rav. So this is Rav talking. So you're allowed to use the following things for an Eruv. You're allowed to use pa'apuin, which is a squash-like vegetable that Rashi defines, or chalag logos, which is purslane, or gudgedonios, which is coriander, kusbara. You're not allowed to use grain, which is cut when it's unripe, when it's still green, and it's eaten in this unripe state, or a special type of dates which are low quality because they never really become ripe at all. So Gemara questions a few of these. Where it says, first of all, coriander you want to use, you can't use coriander because coriander is unhealthy. It's not something that people should eat. How do we know? The Brisa says as follows: coriander is a dangerous thing to eat, and it reduces a man's ability to reproduce, and therefore somebody who has a lot of kids can eat them if they are soft and fresh. However, somebody who doesn't have children enough shouldn't eat them because they will reduce his offspring, and if they're hard, and they're hard enough to already have grown seeds, then nobody should eat it because it has other health issues. So the Gemara offers three answers for how you're allowed to use coriander. The Gemara says, first of all, Rav maybe was referring to the soft ones. The soft ones, he said, you're allowed to eat if you already have enough children. So then it's referring to the soft ones, and either somebody who has enough children, or a second explanation, Rav holds that if it's food for somebody else, you're allowed to use it yourself. Just like we saw that a Nazir is allowed to use wine because other people drink it, and a Yisrael is allowed to use Truma because Kohanim can eat it. So you're also, the person who doesn't have enough children can use coriander that's soft because other people can eat it. The third answer is that there's two types of coriander, and this is referring to the coriander of Madai, the median coriander. That's not going to be dangerous in any ways. Okay, next on the list was chaziz. That's unripe grain that's harvested when it's unripe and eaten. So Gemara says, is it true that you can't make an Eruv out of that? It can't be. Rav Huda said in the name of Rav, you're allowed to use that unripe grain, and you're allowed to use hops. You're allowed to use them for an Eruv, and the bracha is by Priya Dama. That means that it's a proper way of eating it, because if it would be not considered to be quality food, it would lose the bracha, it would become a shahakal. Gemara says it's not a kasha. Rav at some point moved to Bavel. When he arrived in Bavel, he saw that people eat this. And then he changed his psak and said, oh, people are eating it here, so it's food. And that's why he said that the bracha is hadama, and you're allowed to use it for an Eruv. So the Gemara said, why? Just because they eat it that way in one place, like Bavel, doesn't mean that it's a normal way of eating it. Nobody else eats these things. It shouldn't be considered food, even if they eat it that way in Bavel. The Gemara says, I'll prove to you that if one place eats a certain thing in a strange way, that doesn't count. Because in the halacha of Meiser, we said that let's see if a plant that has different parts to it. For example, the seeds might be edible or the stalks might be edible. So which part is considered the food that you have to take meiser from that part of it? You only have to take meiser on the food part of the plant, not the rest of it. So this Brisa says it should follow what most people will do. So for example, beans, barley, and fenugreek are usually planted for their seeds, for their grain. If somebody plants it to use the stalks, so it doesn't count because he's doing something against the rest of the world, and therefore he still only has to take a meiser from the seeds and not from the stalks because his intent is not considered anything at all. Then there are a few types of plants that both are usable, such as shachalayim, which is Cretan, that's like a type of mash, and a plant called gargir. So the Gemara says these, you can eat both the seeds and the stalks, and it's common for people to eat them. So that it depends what he planted it for. Whatever he planted it for, that's what he has to take ma'aser from, because that's the part that's considered to be the main food. So here you clearly see that if you do something weird, it doesn't make it a halachic thing. We still follow the majority. So why should Rav be interested in what they did in Bavel? Bavel is doing something against the rest of the world. The Gemara accepts this, and therefore the Gemara gives a different answer for why Rav said you're allowed to use green grain for ma'aser. The Gemara says that it's talking about a different kind. It's referring to the green grain grown in a garden, unripe grain grown in a garden. It's a different type of food. Okay, now the brisa we had just seen mentioned gargir, something that's edible. The Gemara says, what could you do with that? It's useless. So the Gemara says, in earlier times people didn't have pepper. They used to grind up the gargir and make it into a powder or a dip that they used for the meats. So it's usable in that way. Okay, now on the subject of hops and unripe grain, the Gemara discusses what bracha you make on it. So the Gemara says the following incident of Zera, when he was very tired and unable to learn, he still wanted to make use of his time, as he would go sit at the entrance of the yeshiva of Rav Yehuda bar Hami, and he would say when the Talmidei Chachamim go in and out, I could stand up for them, at least I get schar for that. While he was sitting there, a child was walking by, and he said to the child, what did you learn today? So he said, I learned that the bracha on kishus, on hops, is bari pri adama. And the bracha on chaziz, the bracha on unripe grain, is shahakol niyeh b'dvari. So Rav said, no, it should be the opposite. Grain at least grows from the ground. It should be hadama. Hops grows on the outside. It's like a fungus that grows on the outside of a shrub. So it's nourished from the air. It's not nourished from the ground. So it should be a shahakol. So Gemara says, no, it's not the halacha. The halacha is like what the child said. And the reason is because something which is unripe loses its bracha and it goes down to shahakol. So the green grain is unripe. It loses its hadama and becomes a shahakol. However, the hops, those are fully ripened and therefore it's hadama. And as far as he said that the hops should be a shahakol because they are nourished from the air, it's not true. You'll see if the shrub that they're growing from will die, the hops will die. So they're not just hanging out on the hops and being on the shrub and being nourished by the air. They're actually deriving nourishment through the shrub from the ground itself. Okay, the Gemara now returns to the list of things which you are not allowed to use to make an eruv because they're not food. The Gemara is going to discuss the next thing on the list, which is unripe dates. And the Gemara questions, is it true that unripe dates are not food and you cannot use them for an eruv? Well, I'm going to show you that in other situations they are considered to be food. What other discussions are there? There's the halacha of whether or not they are mitame tumas oichlin, something which is food as a special type of tuma, called tumas oichlin. There's a question of whether or not you're allowed to use meiser sheni money to buy them, as we had seen on the daf previously. In the beginning of this daf, you're only allowed to buy food, something which is edible with meiser sheni money. It doesn't have to be a status of food, but it does have to be edible. It could be non-food, which is edible. You're also allowed to buy meiser. You're allowed to use meiser sheni for. And then there's also the question of actually taking meiser from it. You only have to take meiser from something which is food and has already reached full development. So we have a brisa here. The brisa is discussing two things. It's discussing hearts of palm and unripe dates. And it says that the halacha of hearts of palm is as follows. Hearts of palm are the inside of the palm tree, which will later become the wood of the tree. So the Tanakama says it doesn't count as food. It's not food. So therefore, it's not metamet masaychlin. It is, however, edible, and therefore you're allowed to use meiser sheni money to buy it and eat it. Rabbi Yehuda says it's considered to be wood as far as everything except for the fact that you're allowed to buy meiser sheni money. You're allowed to use meiser sheni money to buy it. The Gemara is going to ask if those two opinions sound exactly the same. We also have the halacha here in this brisa of unripe dates. And the Tanakama says unripe dates are food, and therefore you're allowed to use meiser sheni money to buy it, and it is metamet tumas oichlin. And Rabbi Yehuda says it's considered to be food as far as all its halachas, and again he's agreeing, except for as far as taking meiser from it. You do not have to take meiser from it because since it's not ripe, it doesn't count as anything. Anyway, we see over here that unripe dates are considered food, so why should you not be allowed to make an eruv with them? So Gemara says there's two types of unripe dates. There are unripe dates that are supposed to get ripe, but they're not ripe yet, and therefore they are not considered to be food yet. They're therefore not food yet, and they don't count as food to the extent you could use it for an Eruv, and therefore you can't use those unripe dates for an Eruv. However, Rabbi Yehuda, who said that they are considered to be fruits, and the Brisa, he was talking about where they're never going to get ripe. If they're never going to get ripe, this is as ripe as they ever get. So then you can consider it food then, and that's why it counts as food as far as Master Sheni money and as far as Tomas Eichlin and all that. So Gemara says it can't be that's what he's referring to, because then why would he say that you don't have to take Meiser from it? He said you don't have to take Meiser from these unripe dates. That means that they're not fully grown yet. If they're never going to get any more grown, they never become ripe, so then you would be chayiv in taking Meiser from it now. This is as far as it's going to grow. So the Gemara agrees with that rejection, and therefore the Gemara takes a different answer. So the Gemara says, really we're talking about regular dates that have just not become ripe yet. You picked them too soon. Now, as far as making an Eruv with them, you can't make an Eruv with them because they're not edible. They're too bitter to eat. However, as far as Tumas Eichlin, they are food. And the reason for that is because you can sweeten them. If you roast them, they'll become sweeter. And therefore, they do count as food. And that's why in the Brisa, they are considered to be food, and you can buy Meiser Sheni with them. You can buy them with Meiser Sheni money. But as far as Eruvin, they're not ready to eat yet, and therefore you can't. The Gemara says that's halacha, which was said by Rabbi Yechanan in a different context, that anything that you can sweeten by roasting them counts as food already. What was that context? What was he referring to? That's a different brisa that was discussing almonds. And there are two types of almonds. There's bitter ones and sweet ones. So the sweet ones, as long as they're sweet throughout their entire growth span, and therefore they're food all the way through, and you can buy them with Meiser Sheni, whatever you want. However, you don't have to take Meiser from them until they're fully grown, because when they're not fully grown, it's not chayiv in Meiser yet. However, there's a different type of almonds which are bitter, so while they're small, they're still edible. They're not bitter yet. When they become fully grown, then they get bitter. So the question is, what is its halachic status when it's small and it's sweet, but it's not fully grown? And what is its halachic status when it's big and fully grown, but it's too bitter to eat? So Gemara says a couple of opinions. There's one that says that it is considered food while it's small, and then it's chayiv in Meiser. When it's bigger, it's not. There's one that says that it's chayiv in Meiser, and it is considered food at both stages of development, and there's one that says that it's considered food in neither stage of development. And that Rav Yechanan explained. When it's small, I understand you could eat it. When it's big, why is it considered food? It's inedible. Rav Yechanan said, no, you could roast it, and if you roast it, then it becomes edible, and that's why it's considered food. Okay, now the Gemara goes back to the brisa about the hearts of palm, where we had seen it that the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda both seem to say that the hearts of palm are considered edible, and therefore you can buy them with Meiser Sheni, and they are not considered food because they are considered wood. So the Tanakama had said that you can't. There is no Tumas Eichlin on it because it's considered wood, and Rabbi Yehuda said it's considered wood in all its halacha. So the Gemara says, what's the difference between these two opinions? They seem the same. So Abai said the difference is if you cook them very much or fry them very much. According to the one who says that they're wood, so they are wood no matter what. They will never have Tumas Eichlin no matter what you do to them because they're wood. According to the Tanakama, that's just that they're not edible, and therefore he says that he considers them halachically to not be food. Because even if you can eat them while they're soft, they're still wood, but he doesn't say that they're across the board wood in all their halachas. And therefore he would agree that if you cook them and fry them very much, then they return to the stage of being food, and then they are considered to be food, and it would be mitami to masechel. So that's the difference between the two. Is it considered to be hands down wood, and frying or extensive cooking doesn't help, or it's no, if you fry it and you cook it, then it will be considered food and have Tumas Eichlin. So Gemara says it can't be that there's anybody who holds such a thing. Everybody would agree that if you fry or cook something to the point that it's food, then it will have Tumas Eichlin, because we even have a brisa that says that even the skin of an animal or the amniotic sac, if you cook it enough, it becomes food and it gets Tumas Eichlin. So it can't be that anybody would not hold that way. Therefore, the Gemara now gives a second explanation. The Gemara says no, the machlokes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda here is what bracha is. There's a similar machlokes Amoraim between Shmuel and Rabbi Yehuda the Amora about it. Machlokes is, should it be a shahakal, because hearts of palm are really wood, and you're not going to make a hadama on wood. It's just soft, and therefore it's edible before it hardens into wood. Or is it a hadama because it's considered to be food? It's a fruit of the ground, so you say hadama. So in our brisa, Rabbi Yehuda says it's wood, so it's a shahakal. And the Tanakh Kama says it's food, and therefore it's hadama. Now the Gemara discusses the Amoraim, Shmuel and Rabbi Yehuda, who discussed this, and Shmuel brings a proof to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, who says that it should really be a hadama. And he says that the proof is because look at radishes. If you leave a radish in the ground for too long, it becomes very hard and you can't eat it. Yet we still say hadama. So hearts of palm become hard if you leave them in the tree, but we should say hadama on that. Also, your opinion makes sense. The Gemara says that's not a proof, because radishes are planted to be eaten when they're soft. Trees are planted to become wood, not to be eaten as hearts of palm. And therefore, that's not the intent, and you shouldn't make the bracha hadama on it. And that is the halacha, though the halacha is like Shmuel, that you would make a shahako on hearts of palm. Okay, now the Gemara discusses what is the amount of these vegetables which you would need to set up an eruv. Generally, the rule of an eruv is that it has to be 2 meals worth. However, something that is eaten with bread, you only have to use the amount that you would eat together with bread in 2 meals. It doesn't have to be 2 full meals of this one thing. So the Gemara says, as far as hops and green grain. So hops, it's got to be a handful. The Gemara says that's enough. Green grain is a amount that you wrap up in a bundle when you harvest them. Now, Chilkiah Bar Atavia said there's a plant called kalya that we use. The Gemara says, a second, kalya is too hard that you can't possibly eat. And Gemara says, no, we mean the leaves, which are vegetables of the kalya plant, and that is a handful is enough for that also. Now the Gemara says Rabbi Yirmiyah went out to the villages to check his grains, and they asked him, what's the story with wet beans? You allowed to make an eruv with that? He didn't know. He went to ask in yeshiva, and they said, the Zodariyane said, you're allowed to make an eruv with wet beans, and a handful is enough, that's all you need. And Rav Hanuna said, you're allowed to make an eruv with raw beets. Where he said, what do you mean? Rav Chizda said, raw beets are unhealthy. They can kill you. You can't use that for an eruv. The Gemara says, no, Rav Chizda was talking about unhealthy raw beets as if they're half cooked. Fully raw is not a problem. A different version of this is that Rav Chizda came first and said raw beets will kill you, and therefore you're not allowed to use an eruv for them. And the Gemara asks, what do you mean people eat raw beets all the time? We don't see that they die. And the Gemara says, yeah, fully raw is okay, but half cooked, that's where there's a problem. And Rav Chizda says if you eat cooked beets, it's good for your heart, good for your eyes, and it's good for the stomach. And Abaye says it's only if it's cooked or really cooked. It sits on the pot on the fire for so long until it starts making a noise that sounds like.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.